The candles in the Ashworth ballroom had been burning for 3 hours, and the heat they produced was not warmth but pressure, a dense, waxy heaviness that settled against the skin like a second garment no one had asked to wear. Cordelia Ashby noticed it, the way she noticed everything in that room, cataloguing it, measuring it against the 67 candles she had ordered replaced at 4 o'clock that afternoon, calculating whether the chandelier above the supper table had been trimmed correctly or whether one of the footmen had misread her instruction and used the tallow stock instead of the beeswax she had specifically marked in the household ledger for formal occasions. She stood at the far end of the east gallery, half behind a column, with a small notebook open in her hand and a pencil held between 2 fingers. The notebook contained the evening's seating arrangements, the order of the removes for supper, the names of 3 creditors her uncle intended to charm before midnight, and a single line she had written that morning and underlined twice. The wine merchant expects payment by the 14th, and there is not enough in the household account to give it to him. The ballroom itself was everything a ballroom in the spring season of 1818 was expected to be. The floor had been waxed to a finish that caught and held each candle's reflection. The women moved across it in gowns the colour of cream and pale rose, and a particular shade of blue that seemed, this season, to have been worn by every woman in London simultaneously. The men were correct in their tailcoats and white cravats, and the musicians in the gallery played with the pleasant mechanical accuracy of people who had played this particular set of country dances so many times that the music had ceased to require thought. Her uncle, Sir Reginald Ashby, moved through the gathered guests with the practiced ease of a man who had survived 17 seasons on charm and borrowed credit. He laughed. He pressed hands. He steered people toward the supper room at precisely the right moment. He was, in the language of their world, a very good host. It occurred to Cordelia, not for the first time, that a very good host was simply a man who had delegated everything that required competence and retained only the parts that required an audience. She made a small mark in her notebook. The 3rd remove was running behind. She would need to speak to the cook before 11. And at the edge of all that heated, candle-lit performance, half concealed behind a column with ink on her right forefinger, was Cordelia Ashby. She was 26. She wore a gown she had worn twice before, dove grey silk that had been remade once at the neckline and once at the hem, and which she had pressed herself that morning because the laundry maid had been needed elsewhere. She was not homely, and she was not remarkable. She had the kind of face that a room looked past while looking for something else, which had long since ceased to surprise her, and had come to function, instead, as a form of professional advantage. When the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the butler announced Percival Ashworth, Duke of Harrowfield, the room did what rooms do when something they have been waiting for finally arrives. It shifted, without anyone appearing to move, in a single unified direction. Cordelia did not shift. She glanced up from her notebook, registered the new arrival, and returned to her calculation about the wine merchant. The Duke of Harrowfield was precisely as she had heard, tall, dark-coated, dressed without a single unnecessary ornament. He wore authority the way other men wore their cravats, correctly and without apparent effort. He did not look around the room the way a man looks around a room when he is pleased to be seen. He looked around it the way a man looks at a map when he is trying to establish which exit is nearest. His gaze crossed the length of the East Gallery, paused. Cordelia was already writing again. She did not notice that he had paused, or that his eyes had settled on the column where she stood, or that he looked at her for approximately 4 seconds, with the particular expression of a man who has just identified something he does not yet understand and intends to find out. She was already moving toward the kitchen corridor. She had been managing this household for 4 years. Her father, Thomas Ashby, had died in the spring of 1814, when Cordelia was 22, and the family's affairs were in a condition that the family solicitor had described as complex, and that Cordelia, upon opening the account books, had recognized as catastrophic. Her father had been a good man and a poor steward. He had trusted the wrong agents, signed agreements he had not read carefully enough, and allowed the estate's tenant farms to fall into a state of maintenance arrears that had quietly compounded for a decade, while he attended to things he found more interesting. He had left behind a daughter, no sons, a modest property in Wiltshire, 14 creditors of varying patience, and a brother, Reginald Ashby, who had arrived within the week to assume management of everything Thomas had left, including Cordelia herself. Reginald was not cruel. This was the precise, limiting truth of him. He was not cruel, and he was not competent, and these two qualities together had produced, in the 4 years since her father's death, an arrangement in which Cordelia managed everything of consequence, while Reginald signed his name to the results and appeared, in London, at precisely the right parties, extending precisely the right invitations to precisely the right people, to maintain the fiction that the Ashby household was a household of some standing, run by a man of some substance. The Wiltshire property had been her first project. It had taken her 6 weeks, in the autumn of 1814, to reconstruct the actual state of the tenant agreements, which parcels were in arrears, which leases had been improperly documented, which agents had been collecting rents they were not forwarding in full. She had done this work at a writing desk in her father's old study, by candlelight, with a cup of cold tea at her elbow, and when she had finished, she had a document 12 pages long that showed, to the penny, what the estate owed and what it was actually capable of producing if managed correctly. The estate was capable, she had determined, of producing £240 per annum in net income if the maintenance arrears were addressed, 3 of the poorly performing tenant agreements renegotiated, and the wool merchant contract, which had been signed on unfavourable terms in 1809, replaced with one of the 2 competing merchants whose rates she had investigated by writing 6 letters over the course of a fortnight. She had presented this document to Reginald on a Thursday morning. He had looked at it for somewhat less than 3 minutes, handed it back, and told her she had been very thorough, which was the compliment he gave to things he did not intend to examine further. She had then done everything the document recommended, acting in his name, with his signature on the necessary correspondence, and had not been thanked for it again. By the end of 1815, the estate was producing £231 annually. By 1816, 260, because she had found an additional discrepancy in the wool merchant's measurement records and renegotiated on that basis. By the spring of 1818, it was producing 280, and the maintenance arrears had been cleared entirely, and 11 of the 14 original creditors had been paid in full. The remaining 3 creditors included the wine merchant, whose patience was now exhausted, and 2 others whose bills she was managing in sequence according to the interest rates she had calculated for each. She had done all of this without a title, without acknowledgement, without compensation, beyond her room and her board, and the grey silk gown she had worn twice to her uncle's entertainments. There had been one moment, in the winter of 1815, when she had been shown, clearly and finally, what she was dealing with. It was an evening in February, cold enough that the ink had thickened in her pen, and she had been warming it periodically over the candle, and Reginald had come to find her in the study, with a look on his face that was not anger, but something close to embarrassed impatience. He had told her, gently but clearly, that Lady Hartmore, a woman of some social consequence whose good opinion Reginald was currently cultivating, had remarked that it was irregular for a young woman to be seen going over accounts with the solicitor. It gave an impression, he said, of a household that was not quite correctly ordered. Cordelia had put down her pen. She had looked at him steadily. She had said, "The impression of a correctly ordered household will be easier to sustain, uncle, once the household is actually correctly ordered. Shall I continue?" He had left the room. She had picked up her pen and continued. That was the moment she decided she was not going to become less than she was. Not from bitterness, not from pride, precisely. From something older and quieter than either. the recognition that she had a particular quality of mind that was of genuine use in the world, and that shrinking it to suit Reginald's social anxieties would not make her more comfortable. It would simply make the estate worse, and the debt larger, and her position, ultimately, more precarious rather than less. She had been managing things before breakfast for 4 years. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. Percival Ashworth had attended the Ashby party for reasons he would not have described to anyone as sentimental, because he was not, by any reasonable external measure, a sentimental man. He was 34. He was the 6th Duke of Harrowfield, a title he had assumed at 21 when his father died, of a second apoplectic episode that no one had been particularly surprised by, given the first. The dukedom comprised a principal estate in Derbyshire, a house in Brook Street, 4,000 acres of productive farmland, and a position in London's social hierarchy that operated something like a fixed star. Everything arranged itself around it, without the star being required to move. He had not, in the 13 years since his succession, found a single reason to move. He had arrived at the Ashby party because his investigator, a careful and literal-minded man named Graves, had delivered a report 3 days earlier that contained one detail Percival had not expected and had not been able to set aside. He had commissioned the report because Sir Reginald Ashby had approached him twice in the last month about a business arrangement concerning a proposed land development in Wiltshire, and Percival's practice, on matters of any financial significance, was to understand thoroughly what he was being offered before he agreed to discuss terms. The report on the Ashby household had been intended to establish whether Sir Reginald was a credible partner or a man in difficulties managing them. The report had answered that question within its first 4 pages. Sir Reginald was not a credible partner. The Ashby estate's nominal income masked significant underlying liabilities, the management of which appeared, on examination, to be the work not of Sir Reginald, but of a female relation, a niece, Miss Cordelia Ashby, who had, according to Graves's notes, renegotiated the estate's primary wool contract in 1816 by identifying a measurement discrepancy in the merchant's records, restructured tenant lease agreements across 11 parcels, and reduced creditor exposure from 14 active accounts to 3, all while maintaining the household's social appearances in a manner that had, until Graves specifically looked, concealed the underlying situation entirely. Graves had enclosed, as supporting evidence, a page he had obtained from the estate's accounts ledger. It was in a woman's hand, precise, economical, with annotations in the margin that showed not merely recording of figures, but active analysis, interest calculations, projected recovery timelines, a small notation beside one creditor's name that read, "Assumes patience holds through July, escalate May if not confirmed." Percival had read that page 3 times. He was a man who, in the normal course of his professional life, encountered a great deal of documentation. He had read estate accounts for Harrowfield and 4 neighbouring properties, reviewed investment prospectuses, sat through presentations by men of considerable reputation, and expensively assembled credentials. He had a precise sense of the difference between a person who recorded figures and a person who understood what they meant. The hand on that ledger page belonged to someone who understood. His mother had been such a person. She had died when he was 16, and there had been no one since. Not in the households he'd observed, not among the women presented to him across 13 seasons, who managed the particular quality of attention he associated with her. The combination of scrupulous accuracy and forward-looking judgment that turned a ledger from a record of the past into an instrument for managing the future. He had come to the Ashby party to see. He had not expected to find her at the edge of the East Gallery, with ink on her finger, making notes in a small book, while the room arranged itself around her uncle. He had stood still for 4 seconds, which was longer than he typically stood still for anything. He did not attempt to speak with her that evening. He attended supper, gave Sir Reginald 30 minutes of his attention on the subject of the Wiltshire development, enough to confirm that Reginald understood the surface of his own proposal and very little beneath it, and left at 11 o'clock, well before the dancing ended. In the carriage on the way home, he made two decisions. The first was that he had no intention of investing in the Wiltshire development. The second was that he intended to hear Cordelia Ashby play. Graves had noted, in the report, that she played the pianoforte, that she had been heard, on more than one occasion, playing in the mornings in the room that served as the household's music room, before the family was awake, that the pieces she chose were not the fashionable drawing-room repertoire, but older, more demanding compositions, the kind of music that required more than execution. On 3 consecutive mornings following the Ashby party, Percival arranged to be in the vicinity of Brook Street. The first morning, he heard nothing. The house was silent. The second, he heard voices from a ground-floor window and the sound of the cook's deliveries being negotiated in the kitchen yard. The third morning, at 8:15, walking along the pavement on the far side of the street, he heard a piano. He stopped walking. The music was precise and unhurried. It was a composition he recognized. His mother had played it, years ago, in the music room at Harrowfield, and hearing it here, emerging from a window in Brook Street in the still spring morning, produced in him a sensation he would not have named aloud for anything, but which felt, in the private mechanism of his chest, like a door opening that had been shut for a very long time. He stood on the pavement for 11 minutes. When he arrived at his own house in Brook Street, he wrote 2 letters. The first was to Reginald Ashby, expressing interest in discussing, on a purely preliminary basis, the matter of the Wiltshire estate's management arrangements, with a view to a possible advisory role for the Harrowfield estate's own Derbyshire operations. The second was to his solicitor, asking him to draw up a preliminary framework for a position of estate management consultant, the terms of which would require careful negotiation. He then went to his desk and retrieved the page from Graves's report, the ledger page, in the precise and analytical hand, and read it a 4th time. He did not stand in corridors and listen for things he wanted. He was not that sort of man. He was, however, standing outside in the street for 11 minutes. He was aware this was not nothing. She arrived at Harrowfield in Derbyshire on the 14th of June, having been informed by Reginald that the Duke had made a generous offer for Cordelia to undertake a short consultancy on the Harrowfield estate's northern tenant operations, which had been experiencing some inefficiencies, and that it would reflect well on the family if she accepted. Reginald had used the word consulting in the same tone he used for words like irregular, as though the thing it named was something between an experiment and an inconvenience. Cordelia had understood that she would receive no payment for the consultancy, that Reginald would take what credit was available, and that the invitation was, from the Duke's perspective, something she did not yet have sufficient information to pass. She accepted because she was curious, because the Harrowfield estate's accounts were reportedly in good order, and because the alternative was London in June, with the wine merchant's letter sitting in the left-hand drawer of her uncle's desk, growing more pointed by the day. The house itself met her at the end of a long gravel drive, and she spent the first few minutes of her arrival cataloguing it the way she catalogued everything. The condition of the gate pillars, good. The state of the drive's drainage. One section needed attention near the north curve. The kitchen garden, visible through the east wall, well maintained, productive. She was doing this when the carriage stopped, and she was still doing it when the door opened and a young woman appeared, who was not a servant and was not pretending to be one. "Miss Ashby," the woman said, without ceremony. "I'm Eleanor Crane. I'm nobody of consequence. My father leases the South Farm, but I've been told I'm to be your guide for the house this week, because I know where everything is, and the housekeeper is occupied with the West Wing linens. I hope you don't mind directness." "I prefer it," Cordelia said. Eleanor Crane grinned at her, which was unexpected and agreeable. She was perhaps 24, with a frank, unsentimental face and a way of moving through the house that suggested she had been doing so since childhood. She showed Cordelia the principal rooms, the library, the morning room, and the estate office, which was where, Eleanor said, Mr. Hargreaves worked. Mr. Hargreaves? Cordelia asked. The estate's former steward. He retired last year, but he still comes in 3 days a week, because nobody has the heart to tell him the current steward has reorganized everything and doesn't particularly need the interference. Eleanor paused. That was perhaps too direct. It was exactly direct enough, Cordelia said. Mr. Hargreaves was in the estate office when they arrived, a man of 70 or thereabouts, with the careful posture of someone who had spent 40 years being taken seriously and intended to continue. He looked at Cordelia with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was measuring, the expression of a man who had seen a great many arrangements come and go. Miss Ashby, he said. His Grace mentioned your work on the Ashby estate accounts, the wool merchant renegotiation. He paused. I should like to hear how you identified the measurement discrepancy, when you have time. It was not warmth exactly, but it was recognition. I found the inconsistency in the merchant's quarterly summaries, she said. He was using a different weight standard for the export bales than the domestic. It had been consistent for 6 years, which is why no one had noticed. The figures were internally coherent. They just didn't match the actual bales. Mr. Hargreaves looked at her for a moment. 6 years, he said. £2,200 in aggregate, she said, give or take. He nodded slowly, as though something he had suspected was now confirmed. His Grace has asked me to give you full access to the Northern tenant ledgers, he said. I believe you will find something in them. She found something in them in 4 days. The Northern tenant operations comprised 18 farms. 14 were performing as the accounts showed. 4 were not because of tenant default, but because of a compounding error in the way the maintenance costs were being charged. The charges were being logged against the estate's capital account rather than the operational account, which meant they were invisible to the annual income summary and had been silently reducing the estate's productive capacity for 3 years without appearing in any summary Percival would have reviewed. The cumulative impact was approximately £380 per annum in misattributed cost, money the estate was spending that it appeared not to be spending, which made the Northern operation look more profitable than it was, and had, as a downstream consequence, produced a set of investment decisions about the Northern Farm's expansion that were based on income projections that were, at base, wrong. She documented this across 11 pages, with the figures arranged in 3 columns: what was recorded, what was actual, and what the corrected figure produced, and brought the annotated ledger to the estate office on the 4th evening. She expected to find Mr. Hargreaves. She found Percival. He was standing at the long table in the estate office, in his shirt sleeves. The tailcoat was on the chair behind him, and his cravat was slightly loosened, looking at a set of surveying maps of the Northern farms. He looked up when she came in. He did not appear surprised to see her, which she filed as information. Miss Ashby, he said. Your Grace. She set the annotated ledger on the table with a composure she had earned through practice. I believe I've found what Mr. Hargreaves suspected was there. He crossed to the table. He read without speaking, which she respected. She watched him read, the way his eyes moved across the columns with the specific pace of someone who understood numbers rather than merely registering them, and after 6 minutes he set the ledger down and looked at her. 3 years, he said. 3 years, 2 months. The error originated when the previous steward changed accounting clerks in the spring of 1815, and the new clerk misread the categorical instructions. No one caught it, because the internal figures remained consistent. Consistent, but wrong. Consistent, but wrong, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening light was changing. The study windows faced west, and the late sun came through at an angle that lit the maps and the ledger pages, and her hands, and his face, with the same level, exact clarity. She noticed the cravat was crooked. She had noticed it, actually, when she first came in. It had been crooked since at least dinner, which meant it had been that way for the better part of 40 minutes. She said, "Your cravat has been crooked since dinner, at least." He looked at her. "It is not a criticism," she said. "I simply noticed." He reached up and straightened the cravat with 2 fingers, without looking away from her. "You notice a great deal," he said. "I find it useful," she said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people in a room who have established, with some accuracy, what sort of people they are. "I should like you to review the Southern tenant ledgers as well," he said, "and the investment account for the proposed northern expansion, which I now suspect requires reassessment." "I can begin tomorrow," she said. "Then I will arrange it." He picked up the annotated ledger. He did not return it to her. He set it beside the surveying maps, which was a thing that told her, without a word, that he considered it working material and not a report to be filed. She found that she was glad of this, in a way she did not fully examine. She left the estate office and walked back through the west corridor toward her rooms, and she was halfway there when she pressed one hand, briefly, against the cool stone wall, and stood still for a moment in the lampless corridor. Then she went on. The opposition arrived with Lady Georgiana Belhurst. Lady Georgiana had been expected for a week. Cordelia had heard her mentioned 3 times by Eleanor Crane, once by Mr. Hargreaves, and once, tangentially, by the housekeeper, Mrs. Tate, who had asked with careful neutrality whether Cordelia's rooms were comfortable and whether she required anything additional. Mrs. Tate had the manner of a woman who kept things running and kept her opinions private, and the fact that she had asked about Cordelia's comfort specifically, before any other guest inquiry, was the kind of small specific act that Cordelia understood as genuine. Lady Georgiana arrived on a Thursday afternoon, in a carriage that was better appointed than anything currently in the Ashby household's coach house. She was 23, fair, accomplished in every credential that the social world recognized, and dressed in a shade of blue that managed, somehow, to appear both fashionable and effortless, which Cordelia knew from experience required significant effort to achieve. She was also, from the moment she entered the drawing room and registered Cordelia's presence, very precisely certain of who was relevant in this house and who was not. She said nothing unkind. She was too well trained for anything so direct. She simply spoke, for the first 30 minutes of her introduction to Cordelia, in the particular way that people speak to those they have already categorized as furniture, correctly and without attention, her eyes moving, as she addressed Cordelia, to the window behind her, to the door to Percival's left, to Eleanor Crane, who was in the corner of the room and who met Cordelia's gaze with an expression of private and unvarnished solidarity. At dinner, Lady Georgiana remarked, with a lightness that had been assembled carefully, that she understood Miss Ashby had been reviewing some of the estate's accounts. It was very good of her, she said, to apply herself to something so useful. She herself had never had much head for figures, she added, but then, not everyone was suited to the same occupations. Cordelia set down her wine-glass. She said, pleasantly and precisely, the Northern tenant operations had a 3-year accounting error, compounding against the capital account. The correction improves the estate's net operating income by approximately £380 annually. I do not know that a head for figures is required, so much as a willingness to read the same column twice. The table was briefly quiet. Percival, at the head of the table, said nothing, but he did not look at Lady Georgiana. He looked at Cordelia, and the expression on his face was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who had expected something and had been watching to see it confirmed. Lady Georgiana smiled. "How very thorough," she said. "I find thoroughness reliable," Cordelia said, and returned to her dinner. Eleanor Crane, across the table, pressed her lips together in the particular way of a person suppressing something. The week continued. Cordelia worked through the Southern Tenant Ledgers, the Northern Expansion Investment Account, and, at Mr. Hargreaves's suggestion, the estate's historical records of the wool operations, which had not been formally audited since 1801. She found no additional errors of the northern variety, but she found 3 places where the records could be clarified to reduce future misattribution risk, and she drafted a 2-page set of categorical instructions for the accounting clerk that would prevent the same class of error recurring. Percival read both the draft and the audit summary in the estate office on a Saturday morning. He asked 3 questions, all of them specific, all of them the questions of a man who was reading to understand rather than to appear to understand. She answered them directly. On Sunday evening, she was in the music room. She had found it, a room of quiet proportions with an old pianoforte in excellent tune, on her second day, and had been using it in the early mornings before the household was awake. She had not expected to use it in the evenings. She had gone there because the south terrace door was locked, and the music room was the nearest space of any quiet, and she wanted, after a week of figures and columns and Lady Georgiana's assembled composure, a half-hour that belonged to no one's account. She sat at the pianoforte and played. She played the composition she had been playing that morning in London, the piece she had learned from a book of her mother's that had been among the few things rescued from the Wiltshire house, and she played it without looking at the music, because she did not need it. The room was dim, 1 lamp on the side table, the last of the daylight through the west window. She did not hear the door open. She did not know, until she reached the final phrase and let her hands rest on the keys, that anyone was there. She became aware of it in the way you become aware of stillness, not because something moved, but because it did not. She looked up. Percival was standing in the doorway. He had been there, she understood from his posture, for some time. "I did not mean to intrude," he said. He did not move from the doorway. "You did not intrude," she said. This was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother played that composition. I have not heard it since she died." There were 18 years in that sentence. She understood them without asking. "I am sorry," she said. He nodded, a brief, controlled acknowledgement of something he did not intend to discuss further. But he crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the pianoforte, not beside her on the bench, which would have been one thing, but in the chair, at an angle that let him look at the instrument, rather than at her. This was careful and considered, and she recognized in it the same quality she recognized in his reading of her ledger, attention that did not perform itself. "Your uncle told me you had no particular accomplishments," he said, without judgment. "My uncle tells people what he believes they wish to hear," she said. "He believed you would be more comfortable with a consultant who appeared to be a modest relation than one who might have opinions." "He was wrong," Percival said. "He is often wrong about what makes people comfortable," she said. "He is very good at not being wrong about what makes them agreeable." Percival looked at her. "There is a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is an enormous difference." He stayed for another 20 minutes. They spoke about the estate, about the pianoforte, which was a Broadwood of 1799 that had been his mother's. And when he rose to leave, he paused at the door and said, "The investment account for the Northern Expansion. Your revised projections show the current proposal is premature by approximately 2 seasons." "Yes," she said. "I intend to hold the decision until your analysis is complete. I will not announce that decision to Sir Reginald until we have spoken." This was the most direct form of professional respect she had been offered in 4 years. She recognized it as such, and something in her chest adjusted slightly, like a mechanism that had been running slightly out of alignment, settling back into its correct position. "Thank you," she said. He left. She sat at the pianoforte for a moment, with her hands in her lap. Then she stood, put out the lamp, and went to bed. The formal investor presentation for the Harrowfield Northern Development had been arranged before Cordelia's arrival. A council of 6 men, comprising 2 London investment partners, a senior Derbyshire landowner named Lord Clavering, and 3 associates of the proposed development. It was scheduled for the 21st of June in Harrowfield's council chamber, and it had been organised on the assumption that the Duke's endorsement of the development would be the primary event of the morning. Lord Clavering had been told, through channels Cordelia was not entirely certain of, that the consultancy she was conducting was a formality, a box the Duke was ticking before a decision already made. Lord Clavering was 61, a man of established opinion and long memory. He had known the Harrowfield dukedom for 4 decades, had known Percival's father, and regarded the 6th Duke with the particular combination of respect and proprietary interest that old men hold toward young men they watched grow up and believe they understand. He had no specific objection to Cordelia's presence in the room. He simply did not see her as material to the proceedings. She sat at the far end of the council table, to Percival's left, with her annotated ledger and the revised projection documents she had spent 4 evenings preparing. Mr. Hargreaves sat 2 seats down, with the historical records she had requested. The development's lead investor, a Mr. Fortescue, smooth-voiced and accustomed to rooms like this, presented the proposal in 30 minutes, with the practiced confidence of a man who had been told the decision was, at base, already made. The returns were compelling. The timeline was achievable. The northern expansion of the Harrowfield tenant operations would produce a projected income increase of £600 annually within 3 years. He finished. He looked to Percival. Percival said, "Miss Ashby will speak to the financial analysis." The room adjusted. Lord Clavering looked at her, properly looked at her, for the first time since she had entered, with the particular expression of a man who has just discovered the furniture has an opinion. Cordelia opened the annotated ledger. She did not argue, she did not plead, she presented. She laid out the 3-year accounting error in the northern tenant operations, the figures, the source, the compounding effect. She showed how the income projections underlying Mr. Fortescue's proposal had been built on the uncorrected figures, which meant they overstated the current productive capacity of the northern farms by approximately 14%. She placed 2 pages of documentation in the centre of the table, the original summary the development had relied on, and the corrected version with the recategorised costs. The proposed development assumes a productive base that the estate's actual operations do not currently support, she said. A £600 annual increase on a 14% overstated baseline is not a gain. It is a recovery of ground already lost, presented as new growth. The room was quiet. Mr. Fortescue said, with the particular smoothness of a man regrouping, "The error you describe is a bookkeeping matter. The underlying land capacity has not changed." "The land capacity has not changed," she agreed, "but the capital available to develop it has been misrepresented in your projections, because the operational costs charged against the capital account have been invisible in every summary your proposal drew from. The development, as currently structured, requires capital the estate does not have in the quantities your timeline assumes." She placed the revised projection on the table. The figures were specific, sequential, and required no interpretation. Lord Clavering reached for the document. He read for 3 minutes. She had learned from Mr. Hargreaves in passing, been a solicitor before inheriting his title, a detail that Mr. Hargreaves had mentioned without comment and she had received as useful. He could read a financial document. When he set it down, he looked at her. "When did you find this error?" he asked. 4 days after arriving," she said. "Has anyone audited the southern operations?" "I did. As a secondary review, the south is clean. The error was specific to the northern accounts categorical structure, introduced in 1815. Lord Clavering was quiet for a moment. He looked from the document to Percival. Then, in a voice that had stripped itself of its previous authority and was simply asking, "Why did none of our review identify this?" she said, neutrally, "The internal figures were consistent. An external review that relied on the estate's own summaries would not have seen it. The inconsistency required comparing the detailed ledger entries to the actual account categories, not to each other. This was not an accusation, it was an explanation. She gave it without inflection. Lord Clavering was quiet again. Then he said, "The development needs to be redrawn." Mr. Fortescue said, "My lord, the core proposal needs to be redrawn," Lord Clavering said, in a tone that ended things. He looked at Cordelia once more. The look was not warm, but it was direct, and it was without the furniture expression. He said, to no one in particular, and in a voice that contained, she thought, the precise weight of a man correcting himself, "She has done the work this table should have done 6 months ago." It was not an apology. She did not expect one. She collected her documents. Her hands were steady. Percival had not spoken since he introduced her. He stood now, and the room stood with him, because rooms do that, and he looked at Mr. Fortescue and said, with the calm of someone announcing a conclusion rather than a dispute, "The development is suspended pending a full reanalysis on corrected figures. You will work from Miss Ashby's revised projections." He paused. "She will review any resubmission before it comes to this table." Mr. Fortescue opened his mouth and closed it. Lady Georgiana was not in the council chamber. She was in the drawing room with Eleanor Crane, and Eleanor, who had heard the broad account from the corridor where she had been entirely coincidentally standing, told her what had occurred with an enthusiasm that she described as simple factual reporting. Cordelia walked back through the corridor from the council chamber and paused in the doorway of the estate office, because her hands, now that the presentation was finished, wanted something to do, and sorting the documents was a task with clear edges. Percival found her there 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway in the same posture he had occupied the first evening, not urgent, not performing, simply present. "Lord Clavering," he said, "would like to know if you are available for the Derbyshire Drainage Survey in September." Cordelia filed one page and looked at him. "That is not a consultancy question," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." She was quiet. She looked at the documents in her hands, the 11 pages she had produced, the corrected figures, the categorical instruction set for the clerk, and she thought about what it would mean to stay, and what it would mean to return to Brook Street, and the wine merchant's letter, and Reginald's signatures on everything she had done. "You are asking me something else," she said. "I am asking you something else," he said. She said, "You should ask it directly. I am better at direct things." He crossed the room. He did not kneel. They were in the estate office, alone, with the afternoon light through the west windows, and there was no audience here. He stood 2 feet from her, with the complete stillness she had come to understand was not coldness, but the posture of a man who has made a decision and intends to hold it. He said, "I have spent 13 years doing this work without someone who could read what I was reading. I did not know that was what was wrong until I heard you through a window in Brook Street at 8:15 in the morning." She looked at him steadily. He said, "I am not asking because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes. I am asking because you named a 3-year error in 4 days, and then explained it to a room full of men without losing your composure or theirs, and you straightened my cravat after 40 minutes, and you played my mother's composition as though it was something you had been keeping safe." She set down the documents. She thought about it, because she thought about everything completely before answering. She said, "Yes." The formal announcement, the one that required an audience, a witness, a room, came 3 days later at a dinner that Percival had called, which included Lord Clavering and Mr. Hargreaves and Eleanor Crane's father and 2 of the county's senior families and Reginald Ashby, who had arrived from London in a condition of mild bewilderment that he was managing by pretending he had understood the situation all along. Cordelia wore the dove-grey gown. She had pressed it that morning herself, because old habits had their own logic. At the conclusion of dinner, Percival rose, and the table rose with him, because it always did. He looked at Cordelia across the table and said, with the precise and deliberate weight of a man who understood exactly what the room was witnessing, "I have asked Miss Ashby to be my wife, and she has done me the honour of accepting. I intend to make that clear to this company, because she has spent a sufficient number of years being the most important person in any room she entered, without being recognised as such, and I am not inclined to allow the pattern to continue." He reached across the table and took her gloved hand in his, and lifted it and kissed it, with the entire table watching, and the room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which the air was simply still, and then Lord Clavering set down his glass and said, "About time someone saw it," in the tone of a man who was not giving ground gracefully, but was giving it, and that was sufficient. Eleanor Crane, 2 seats down, made no attempt at all to suppress anything. Reginald Ashby said, to the general table, that he had always had the highest regard for his niece's capabilities, which was the most complete fiction she had heard him produce, and she allowed it to stand, because she had learned when corrections were necessary and when they were simply noise. She looked at Percival across the table, her hand still in his. He was not looking at the room, he was looking at her. He had the expression, not a smile, not precisely, but the specific relaxation of a face that has been holding something in careful stillness for a long time, and has decided, finally, to set it down. She felt, in the region of her sternum, something that was not electricity, and was not weather, and was not anything she had language for that was clean enough to use, only the settled, irreversible recognition that this was real, that it had been built on specific and documented ground, and that it would hold. She was married to Percival Ashworth, 6th Duke of Harrowfield, in the church at the edge of the estate in September of 1818, with Eleanor Crane and Mr. Hargreaves and Mrs. Tate in attendance, and the reception held in the Great Hall, which had not been used for anything celebratory in 11 years, a fact that Mrs. Tate conveyed with the particular economy of a woman who had been waiting for the occasion, and was very glad of it. Reginald Ashby attended and told 4 separate people that he had always thought Cordelia was destined for something extraordinary, a claim she heard reported to her afterward, and chose not to examine closely. Lady Georgiana Belhurst sent a very correct gift and a very correct note, and was subsequently known, in the following seasons, to speak of the new Duchess of Harrowfield with a careful precision that suggested she had recalibrated without enjoying it, which Cordelia considered a reasonable outcome. The first thing Cordelia did, in her new capacity, was complete the Northern Development reanalysis she had begun before the wedding. She submitted it to Percival and Lord Clavering in October, with a revised proposal that reduced the initial capital requirement by 40%, by sequencing the development across 4 seasons rather than 2. Lord Clavering read it in a single sitting and sent a note to Percival that said only, "She is right." The development began the following spring on her timeline. Within 3 seasons, it was producing exactly the income her corrected projections had forecast, and the annotated methodology she had developed for sequencing the capital expenditure was subsequently adopted, at Mr. Hargreaves's recommendation, by 2 neighbouring estates, whose own stewards had heard about it by way of the Derbyshire Solicitors' Network. It was not a grand legacy. It was a practical one, built from 11 pages of careful columns and a willingness to read the same figure twice. The wine merchant was paid, finally, from the estate funds she redirected to the Ashby household in the first month of the marriage, a payment Percival had arranged without being asked, because he had read the original Graves report carefully enough to know about the wine merchant, and because competence, in his view, included the recognition that some problems needed to be solved before they were named. She found the payment record in the household accounts one evening and sat with it for a moment, alone in the estate office. Then she added it to the ledger and went on. Their son, James Thomas Ashworth, was born in the summer of 1820. He had Percival's dark eyes and Cordelia's particular form of attention. He watched things from a young age with the focused, systematic interest of someone building an inventory, and at 3 years old he could tell you, with accuracy, how many horses were in the south stable, how many footmen were at dinner, and whether the number of candles in the dining room was greater or lesser than the night before. He was, Cordeval thought, going to be either extremely useful or extremely difficult to deceive, and either way she considered that an excellent quality in the heir to a dukedom. Percival had reached the same conclusion from a different direction, and had said so, with the particular dry precision that she had learned was his version of delight. The library at Harrowfield had a window that faced east, and in the mornings, when the light came in clean and direct before the household was fully awake, it lit the desk where she worked in a way that was functional and pleasant. James had, at 2.5, discovered that the gap between the library's reading chair and the windowsill was exactly large enough to crawl into, and approximately large enough to fall asleep in, and he did both regularly, while she worked at the desk 6 feet away. She became aware, one morning, that she was not alone in the library, not James, who was asleep in his corner, but Percival, who had come to the doorway in the quiet way he had, and was standing there looking at her. She did not look up immediately. She made the notation she was making, finished the line, and then looked up. He was watching her, the way he had watched her from the beginning, with the specific, considering attention of a man who has identified something valuable and intends to keep watching it for as long as he is permitted. He had the letter from the Derbyshire solicitors in one hand, unopened, and he had clearly forgotten about it. She said, "You have been standing there since I finished the south column." "I have," he said. "And?" He looked at her. He said, "I was thinking that I stood outside a window in Brook Street for 11 minutes and heard you play, and I cannot adequately account for the 13 years I spent before that." She set down her pen. She looked at him across the library in the morning light, with their son asleep in the chair, and the estate's accounts in order on the desk, and the letter from the solicitors in his forgotten hand. And she said, "You found me. That is accountable enough." He came into the room. He sat in the chair beside the desk. He picked up the letter, remembered it, set it down again. James stirred, resettled, did not wake. Outside, the east light held steady. The house was running correctly, all of it. The kitchen, the farms, the tenant agreements, the 3 neighbouring estates that had written for her advice this past year, the second volume of annotated accounts she was compiling that Mr. Hargreaves called, with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, the most useful document produced by this estate in a generation. It was all in order, and it was all hers, not by title alone, not by Percival's name, but because she had built it, column by column, page by page, with her own particular and irreplaceable quality of mind. She picked up her pen. She returned to the accounts. He stayed.